I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and what I'd like to do in this video is provide students who are getting started in Latin Reading 1 with a step-by-step demonstration of how you should complete the lessons so that you can easily master the Latin reading, master all of the vocabulary, and learn the important skill of being able to translate from one language into another. Once you get the hang of this in Latin reading, you can use this same method to study and learn any language. You can do it with Greek, you can do it with Spanish, French, Italian, German, whatever you'd like. It's a very valuable study method, and once you get the hang of it, it's quite pleasant to practice. So what I'd like to do is walk you through how you should go about studying a lesson in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Latin reading course. In every lesson, and on my computer to the right, I just have the lesson visible, the same lesson you would see if you open the lesson for Latin Reading 1, Lesson 1, reading the Gospel of St. John, Chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. You see at the top of the page, you have the actual Latin text that we're going to be reading. And then under that, you have a section that's titled an Exposition. And in the exposition, I provide a word-by-word translation with information about each word, and then I usually provide an English translation that helps you to simply work through these lessons and learn to translate the Latin into English. It's very simple, but I think students often don't want to do what I call translation exercises. They think that they're just going to study the vocabulary list and then go take the quizzes. But what you'll find is that that's actually a more difficult method that may end up causing you to progress more slowly than you would if you just learned to do the translation exercises. Studying the vocabulary may be quicker and easier for you in Lesson 1 because translation exercises are unfamiliar to you. But as you get more familiar with translation exercises, they're going to get faster and faster and easier. And memory work is not necessarily going to get faster and easier. So don't be misled by the first lesson, thinking that studying the vocabulary will help you to make the most progress. It's actually true that learning to do the translation exercises and make it a daily discipline, something you always do. You always put 30 minutes or so a day into translation exercises. You'll quickly learn the content of all of these lessons and be able to translate the Latin reading into English. So what I'd like to do is, on the board, I'm just going to walk you through this exercise just as if I was completing it on a sheet of notebook paper as a student. So I would get started, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy out the Latin from the lesson onto my paper. And the way that you should do this is when you copy the Latin text, you should copy it in all capital letters, all uppercase. And you should write with pretty large print when you're copying the Latin, because the English will usually take up more space than the Latin. So write with large uppercase letters and copy out the Latin text. Copy it across one line and then skip a line and continue copying, on the second line down, and continue that until you've copied the entire passage, all 5 verses from your lesson onto your paper. So let's just go ahead and do that. I'm going to copy out the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. So starting at verse 1, we have in principio, and notice I'm writing with large uppercase letters. In principio erat verbum, et verbum, just copying out the Latin. Then I'm going to skip a line on my paper. Et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. Hoc erat in principio apud Deum. And I'm just going to continue, skip a line. Omnia per ipsum facta sunt et sine ipsum, actually sine ipso factum est nihil quod factum est. And I'll stop there because I've run out of space on the chalkboard. But you can see I just simply copied the Latin in large uppercase letters and skipped a line after each line of Latin text. You'll also notice that I can write this out from memory. And that's not because I sat around memorizing the scriptures. I can write this out from memory because I've done the translation exercises again and again. And when you do that, you slowly and steadily memorize the Latin that you're translating. So that's step one of the translation exercises, to simply copy out the Latin text onto your paper, large uppercase letters for the Latin, skip a line after each line of Latin text, and copy out all 5 verses of the Latin reading, just as you saw me do. But as I said, I stopped because I simply ran out of space on the board. You'll have plenty of space on your paper. So now that I've copied out this Latin text, I'm going to use the exposition section to write the English translation under each word in the Latin text. I'm going to translate word for word using the exposition, using my lesson to guide me. I'm not going to use the lesson here because I already know this, but you would simply use your lesson, use the exposition section to help you write the meaning of each Latin word under that word on the blank line. So let's go ahead and do that. If I were to look at my lesson and look up the word in, I would see that in English it just means in. And I'm going to write a little bit smaller in English because English takes up more space. In, and then we have the word principio, and if I look that up in the exposition, I see that it means beginning. And so I'm just going to write the English in small print right under that Latin word. In beginning, erat, the exposition tells me that erat means was, it's a verb. Verbum, the exposition tells me that verbum means word. The exposition tells me that et means and then I have verbum again. And I continue. Erat, the same word we saw here, means was. Apud, the exposition tells me that apud means with. The exposition tells me that deum means God. And that et, again, same word, means and. Deus here is a different form of the same noun. It means God again. Erat, we already saw that twice. It means was. And verbum, we've already seen that twice. That means word. And I'm just going to keep going using the exposition to work word by word through the Latin text. The next word in our reading is hoc, and I see the exposition may say this, or it may say the same. I think it says vis. Erat, we already know that means was. In principio, we already saw that phrase at the beginning. It means in beginning. And notice I'm writing the English text a little small. Apud Deum, we already saw that, with God. Apud means with, and Deum means God. Omnia, the exposition tells me that omnia means all things, or everything, all things. Per ipsum, per can mean by or through, and ipsum means him. Now you'll see I write a couple of possible meanings for some of these words, because off the top of my head I'm not sure exactly what the exposition says. The exposition will give you the best possible translation for the passage that you're working on. So always follow the exact words of the exposition, okay? I'm just walking you through this to show you how this word by word translation exercise works. We continue. Facta, I look up on the exposition and I see facta means made. Sunt means are. Et, we've already seen et before, it means and. I then see that sine means without. Ipso, ipso, we already saw the word ipsum. Here we see ipso. It's a different form of the same word, and it means him again. Him. Factum. Factum is another form of this word, facta. Factum also means made. Est means is. Nihil, the exposition tells me it means nothing. Quod means which or that pronoun. Factum est. We just saw that. Factum est. Made is. And so as I go through the Latin, I translate it word for word into English, following exactly what the exposition says for each word. And now I've walked through, let's say I've walked through all 5 verses of the Latin text. That's my first time through. So that may take you the first half hour that you put into the translation exercise. You may just walk through the first time. Now, once you've done that, you can take some time and look at the words and try to remember and memorize the vocabulary. And then the next day, or even right after that, if you want to just continue working on this, you'll just scratch this, flip the paper over, get a new sheet of paper, copy out the Latin again, and do it all over again, and do it all over again, and do it all over again, until you can write out the Latin text, maybe from memory, or just from copying it from the lesson. It doesn't matter. And then you'll be able eventually to write the word-by-word translation without having to look at the exposition. And that's when you know that you've mastered the lesson. So often, students will take a quiz in Latin Reading 1, and they'll score, let's say, 67%. And they'll wonder, what am I getting wrong? I don't know what I'm getting wrong. How can I pass this quiz if I don't know what questions I'm getting wrong? You shouldn't be getting 67%. The only way that you can be getting 67% is if you haven't done the translation exercises. If you do this and repeat this exercise until you can write out the translation of every word just as the exposition says from memory, you're not going to get 67% on the quiz in Latin Reading 1. You might get one wrong, you might misspell a word, you might get something simple confused, but you may have 2 wrong, maybe 3 wrong, and you should be close to 90%. Even if you make a couple silly mistakes, you should be close to 90%, which is the passing grade. So if you have a very low score, I know that you did not do the translation exercises. And if you did the translation exercises, you would not have a low score. So that's the method for studying and translating the Latin into English. Now there's another translation exercise, and what I'll do is keep this up here, and I'm going to erase just the Latin. I'm going to erase all the Latin. So all that I have left is my English translation. So what you could do for this second part of this exercise, after you've written out your English translation word for word, don't move anything around or make any adjustments, write the translation word for word. After you've done that, you can copy the English translation. And then what we're going to do, instead of writing the English translation of the Latin text, we're going to try to remember what the original Latin text was and write each Latin word above its English translation. So you'll work through that like this. In Latin was in, and beginning was principio. Was, in Latin, was erat, and word was verbum. And was et, and word again, verbum. Was erat, with was apud, God here was deum. Remember, it wasn't deus, that was a different form that was used somewhere else. Et, again, was and. And was et. I got that backwards. God here was deus. Two different forms. You need to remember that. When you work from English back into Latin, you need to make sure you remember the different forms. And God was erat, word, verbum. This, hoc, was erat, in beginning, in principio, with God, apud Deum. All things, that was the Latin word omnia. By or through him, that was per ipsum. Made are, made was here, was facta. Are was sunt. And was et. Without was sine. Without him was sine ipso. Made here, even though it's the same made and made, that was facta, but this one was factum. Was est. Nothing was nihil, which was quod. And made is, again, was factum est. And so now I've worked this second time from English back into Latin. And what you can do now, once you've written out the translation from English back into Latin, you can look at your lesson and compare the original Latin text to the Latin that you've written and make sure every detail is exactly the same. Now, when you can do this in both directions, from Latin into English translation and from your English translation back into the original Latin, when you can do that perfectly with no more help from your lesson or from the exposition, then you'll know that you've mastered this lesson. And if you were to go then and take the quiz for that lesson, you'd find that you either get a perfect score, or, as I said, you may make one or two silly mistakes, like you may misspell a word, or get factum confused with facta, something like that, something simple, but you should be pretty close to passing or already passing the first time you take the quiz. If you take the quiz and don't get a good grade, you don't get 90 or higher, you need to realize that you haven't done enough of the translation exercise, you haven't studied carefully enough, and there's no problem with the quiz that you need to worry about. It's not some technical issue. Other students are passing these quizzes and earning perfect scores, and if there is a student having trouble with a quiz problem, it's usually when a student is advanced and they're taking a new quiz that's just been published. So if you're getting started today, it's unlikely that you're going to run into any quiz troubles. It's simply going to be that you haven't studied well enough yet. So that's how you complete the translation exercises in Latin Reading 1, and we do the same thing in Latin Reading 2, in Latin Reading 3. We do the same thing in Greek Reading 1 and Greek Reading 2, and we'll do the same thing if we offer other languages in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This simple translation exercise will lead you most quickly, most easily to mastery of these lessons. It's going to take you some time. It's going to be awkward the first time you're completing the first lesson because it's a practice that you have to get used to. But once you get the hang of this, you're going to be able to do it more and more quickly, and you're going to be able to work through the lessons more and more quickly. So don't be discouraged if the first lesson, it takes you a lot of time to get done with these translation exercises. That's just because you're learning the exercise. But once you do learn the exercise and it becomes normal and you're comfortable with it, you're going to find that you can work through lessons pretty quickly by just copying, translating, back and forth, until you can do it from memory with no help from your lesson. One other important note that I'd like to make before I wrap up this video is that when you take a quiz in Latin Reading 1, the quiz tests the translations of that lesson, of that specific lesson. So if you take a lesson 1 quiz, the meanings of the words on the quiz will be based on the meanings in the exposition for that lesson. And if you take a quiz on a different lesson, let's say lesson 4, you may find that some of these words are given a different translation in a different passage, a different lesson. And the quiz for that lesson will quiz the meaning of that word in that lesson. So you can't use your knowledge from lesson 1 to complete the quiz in lesson 2 or lesson 5. You need to make sure you study every lesson by itself, and when you take a quiz and you see a word that you've seen in a number of different lessons, and maybe you've seen it with a number of different translations, and you wonder, which is the right one? The right answer for the quiz is the way that it was translated in that lesson. Okay, so that's sometimes a cause of trouble for students, especially when the students don't do the translation exercises and they try to just rush into the quiz and try to pass the quiz, and they find out that they're getting answers marked wrong for words that they think they know the meaning of. And it's true. They knew the meaning of that word in verse 4, but it doesn't mean the same thing in verse 24. And so you need to make sure you study the translation, study the exposition for every individual lesson to prepare for the quiz for that lesson. And if you want to go back and review old lessons, you can't just jump back into the quiz. What you should do is review the lesson, maybe write out the translation exercise one time just to refresh your memory, and then take the quiz for that lesson. So I hope that's a helpful guide for how to study in Latin Reading 1. As I said, if you practice this method and get comfortable with it, you're going to be able to move very quickly through Latin Reading 1, into Latin Reading 2, into Greek Reading 1, into other languages, and so on. It's really the key to learning new languages. So I hope that's a helpful video. If you have any questions about these translation exercises or how to study Latin Reading 1 or any of our language courses, please contact me. You can post on the Academy forums, or you can send me an email to mail@classicalliberalarts.com. If you're a subscribed student and you have a premium student subscription, we can talk about these things in our live weekly meetings when we chat. I can provide tutorial help for you. If you have any questions about the translations or lessons, that's what those weekly meetings for us are for. So we can discuss any questions you have about your lessons, and I can help you move through those lessons as quickly as possible. So I hope that's helpful. Good luck with your studies in Latin Reading 1. God bless your studies here and in all of your courses.